May 20th, 1942. 09:15 hours. Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, surrounded by the perpetual clatter of IBM tabulating machines and the acrid smell of cigarette smoke. The windowless space, officially designated Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, but known simply as Hypo, maintained a constant temperature of 68 degrees to protect the code-breaking equipment. Rochefort, unshaven and wearing his trademark red smoking jacket over khaki trousers, stared at the latest intercept sheet. The Japanese Navy had been transmitting in their operational code, JN-25B, with unusual intensity for the past 72 hours. His team had broken perhaps 40% of the code, enough to glimpse the outline of something massive forming in the Western Pacific. The intercept was fragmentary, full of gaps where code groups remained unsolved, but certain elements stood out clearly: references to an invasion force, mentions of carriers, multiple carriers, and repeated appearances of a two-letter designator that sent a chill through every cryptanalyst in the room. AF. AF was the target. And Rochefort believed with growing conviction that AF meant Midway. The problem was simple and terrifying in equal measure. He couldn't prove it. The Japanese used geographic designators for operational security, two-letter codes that referred to locations without naming them explicitly. Hypo had identified dozens of these designators over the past months. AH was Pearl Harbor. A G was probably Fiji. But AF had appeared only sporadically in earlier traffic, always in contexts too vague to pin down with certainty. Some analysts at OP-20G in Washington believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands. Others thought it might be Oahu itself, a second strike at Pearl Harbor. Without certainty, the Pacific Fleet couldn't concentrate its forces, and concentration was everything when facing the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, needed proof, not educated guesses or analytical probability, hard, verifiable proof that would justify committing his 3 remaining carriers to a single point of ambush. The United States had entered the war 6 months earlier with 7 Pacific carriers. 4 were gone, Lexington sunk at Coral Sea just 2 weeks prior, Yorktown damaged and limping back to Pearl, Saratoga torpedoed and under repair in Bremerton, Wasp still in the Atlantic. That left Enterprise, Hornet, and possibly Yorktown if the yard workers could perform a miracle. Against them, Japanese intelligence suggested Yamamoto would deploy at least 4 carriers, possibly 6, backed by the most powerful battleship force ever assembled. 3 American carriers against 4 or more Japanese. Acceptable odds only if you knew exactly where to position yourself. Suicidal odds if you guessed wrong. Rochefort understood the mathematics of disaster. He also understood that somewhere in the intercepted traffic was the answer, if he could just force the Japanese to reveal it themselves. The idea came to him at 0300 hours on May 19th, during one of his characteristic all-night sessions in the basement. It was elegant in its simplicity, audacious in its execution, and potentially catastrophic if the Japanese saw through it. He would make the enemy confirm AF's identity by creating a false crisis that only Midway could logically transmit. The Japanese monitors, always listening, would report it up their chain of command. And if Hypo's hypothesis was correct, subsequent Japanese traffic would reference the crisis in connection with AF. He pitched it to Captain Lyndon McBride, Nimitz's intelligence officer, at 0800. McBride's initial response was concern. The gambit required cooperation from Midway's garrison commander and absolute confidence that Japanese intelligence was monitoring the right frequencies. If the deception failed, or if the enemy recognized it as planted information, it would reveal that the Americans had penetrated JN-25B. the entire strategic advantage of the code break would evaporate. But the alternative was worse: gambling 3 carriers on an educated guess. Nimitz approved the operation at 1400 hours on May 19th with characteristic brevity. Do it. Fast. The deception required a 2-stage transmission. First, Midway would send a message via underwater cable to Pearl Harbor, secure from Japanese intercept, reporting a fictional crisis with their freshwater distillation plant. Second, Midway would transmit the same crisis over open radio using a low-level code the Americans knew the Japanese had broken. The message had to be believable, urgent enough to prompt immediate Japanese attention, but not so dramatic it would smell like bait. Lieutenant Commander Cyril Simard, commanding officer of Midway's Naval Air Station, received the coded instructions on the morning of May 20th. The cable directed him to transmit, in the clear after minimal encryption, that Midway's water distillation system had suffered a catastrophic breakdown. The garrison could sustain itself for approximately 2 weeks on reserve supplies, but any extended operations would require emergency deliveries. The message should sound like routine logistics traffic, concerned but not panicked, specific enough to be credible. At 1000 hours local time on May 20th, Midway's radio operator sent the transmission on the standard logistics frequency. The message used the administrative code, a low-security cipher the Japanese had demonstrated capability to read. It reported mechanical failure in the number 2 evaporator unit, estimated repair time of 10 to 14 days, current reserve supply at 12,000 gallons with daily consumption of 800 gallons, and a request for priority delivery of a replacement condenser coil from Pearl Harbor's supply depot. Then they waited. The Japanese listening post on Wake Island intercepted the transmission within minutes. Wake had fallen to Japanese forces on December 23, 1941, after a bitter 16-day defense. The victors had converted the island into a forward intelligence station, monitoring all American communications in the Central Pacific. The intercept operators, trained at the Imperial Navy's Communications School at Ominato, recognized the administrative traffic pattern immediately and forwarded the decoded message to their intelligence section. By 1400 hours, Tokyo time on May 21st, the intelligence summary reached the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. It was precisely the kind of tactical information that operational planners valued: specific, current, exploitable. More importantly, it concerned Midway, where the staff already knew a major operation was being planned. The summary classified the information as reliable and assigned it a moderate priority rating. Back in Pearl Harbor's basement, Rochefort's team maintained their vigil. The critical question wasn't whether the Japanese had intercepted the bait — they certainly had, given Wake's monitoring capability — but whether they would reference it in operational traffic. That would take time. Perhaps 24 hours. Perhaps longer. Each hour that passed without confirmation increased the risk that Washington skeptics would convince Nimitz to hedge his bets, to disperse the carriers rather than concentrate them at Midway. The first hint came at 0320 hours on May 22nd. A Japanese message in JN25B, intercepted by station CAST in Melbourne and relayed to HYPO, contained a 5-digit code group that translated to water supply, followed immediately by the designator AF. The message was fragmentary, perhaps 30% readable, but the juxtaposition was suggestive. 2 hours later, another intercept appeared. This one originated from Kura Naval District, referencing supply difficulties and AF in the same sentence. At 0847 hours, the confirmation arrived. A Japanese intelligence summary, transmitted from Tokyo to the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato, contained a clearly readable section that Hypo's linguist, Lieutenant Commander Alva Laswell, translated with methodical precision. The AF Air Unit reports that they are short of fresh water due to trouble in their evaporators. They have asked for supply from the outside. According to captured documents, they have no ammunition supply base there. Rochefort read the translation 3 times, then walked to the secure telephone that connected directly to Nimitz's office. The call lasted less than 60 seconds. When he hung up, he permitted himself the first genuine smile in days. AF meant Midway. The Japanese had confirmed it themselves in their own operational traffic, believing they were reporting intelligence about their target's vulnerabilities. The trap was set. What followed was a cascade of strategic decisions that would reshape the Pacific War. Nimitz immediately ordered all available forces to converge on Midway. Enterprise and Hornet, designated Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were already at sea following a rushed turnaround at Pearl Harbor. Yorktown, which had limped into Pearl on May 27th with damage that the yard superintendent estimated would take 3 months to repair, received an impossible directive: make her operational in 72 hours. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard accomplished what remains one of the legendary feats of wartime shipbuilding. Working around the clock, 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown's wounded hull. They couldn't fix everything. The list of deferred repairs ran to 17 pages, but they could make her fight. Welders sealed ruptured frames, electricians bypassed damaged systems, and artificers jury-rigged solutions to problems that ordinarily required weeks of specialized work. Yorktown departed Pearl Harbor on May 30th with yard workers still aboard, carrying tools and welding equipment they would use to continue repairs underway. She formed the core of Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who assumed tactical command of all American forces for the coming battle. The 3 American carriers carried between them 233 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Against them, Japanese intelligence estimated Midway held perhaps 60 aircraft of various types. The math seemed overwhelmingly favorable to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 1st Air Fleet's carrier striking force. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, embarked 248 aircraft operated by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were the same ships and many of the same pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, then rampaged through the East Indies and Indian Ocean virtually unopposed. But Nagumo didn't know about the 3 American carriers positioned 200 miles northeast of Midway. Japanese intelligence catastrophically had placed Enterprise and Hornet near the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles away. They believed Yorktown was still under repair or possibly sunk. Reports varied depending on which intelligence summary you read. This failure of reconnaissance and analysis would prove fatal. The operational plan Imperial Navy planners had developed was complex, perhaps overcomplicated. The main attack force would strike Midway at dawn on June 4th, suppressing the island's defenses to prepare for an amphibious assault scheduled for June 7th. Once Midway fell, Japanese strategists believed the American Pacific Fleet would be forced to respond, steaming west from Pearl Harbor directly into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers would annihilate them. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, positioned his battleships 300 miles northwest of Nagumo's carriers specifically to engage the American fleet when it appeared. The flaw in this plan was its fundamental assumption that the Americans would react to events rather than anticipate them. Rochefort's code-breaking had inverted the equation. Instead of responding to the Japanese attack, Nimitz would ambush the attackers. Fletcher and Spruance received their orders on June 2nd via encrypted transmission. They were to position themselves northeast of Midway, beyond search range of Nagumo's reconnaissance aircraft, and wait. When the Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway, and intelligence indicated this would occur at approximately 0430 hours on June 4th, The American carriers would know the enemy's position and have a window of perhaps 2 hours when the Japanese flight decks would be cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. That was the moment of maximum vulnerability, the narrow opportunity when speed and surprise could offset numerical inferiority. Everything depended on timing, position, and the accuracy of Rochefort's intelligence. Get any element wrong, and the American carriers would either miss the Japanese entirely or encounter them at full readiness. In either case, the likely outcome was the destruction of the American force and complete Japanese control of the Central Pacific. If you're still here, thank you. Please consider subscribing so more people can discover these stories from history. June 4th, 1942, 0430 hours. 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The 4 Japanese carriers turned into the wind, increasing speed to 24 knots for launch operations. The pre-dawn darkness was breaking to the east, revealing unlimited visibility under scattered clouds at 3,000 feet. Sea state was calm. 1-foot swells from the southeast, ideal for flight operations. Aboard Akagi, the flagship, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 aircraft into the air, 36 Nakajima B, 5 N, Kate bombers carrying 800-kilogram bombs for the land strike, 36 Aichi D, 3A Valdive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A, 6M0 fighters for escort and air superiority. Nagumo held back a reserve strike force, 36 Kates armed with torpedoes and 36 additional Vals in case American ships appeared. This reflected Japanese doctrine, which emphasized maintaining a ready reserve to respond to unexpected developments. It was sound tactical thinking. It would also create the conditions for catastrophe. The strike force reached Midway at 0630 hours and encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance. Marine Fighting Squadron 221, operating obsolescent Brewster F, 2A Buffaloes, and Grumman F, 4F. Wildcats, launched from Eastern Island to intercept. The result was predictably one-sided. The Zeros shot down 15 of 26 Marine fighters in less than 10 minutes, but the delay forced Tominaga's bombers to penetrate a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire thicker than intelligence had predicted. Midway's defenders had been reinforced over the previous week with additional batteries of 3-inch and 5-inch guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across likely approach corridors. The attack damaged installations across both islands but failed to suppress Midway's capabilities. Tominaga's radioed assessment at 0700 hours was blunt. There is need for a second attack wave. The airfields remained operational, most aircraft revetments were intact, and the anti-aircraft batteries continued firing throughout the raid. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo faced a tactical dilemma that would become the subject of military analysis for decades. His reserve strike force was armed for anti-ship operations, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, but Midway clearly required another land attack mission with high-explosive ordnance. At 0715 hours, he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed. Deck crews immediately began the time-consuming process of lowering torpedoes into the magazines and bringing up 800-kilogram bombs. Fusing the bombs, mounting them on the aircraft, and conducting safety checks would require at least 90 minutes. At 0728 hours, a radio report from the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance float plane changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. American ships, northeast of Midway. Exactly where doctrine said they shouldn't be. Nagumo's first question was obvious. Were there carriers? The float plane's initial report didn't specify ship types. If these were merely cruisers and destroyers, a surface group without air cover, they could wait. But if carriers were present, they represented an immediate existential threat. At 07:47 hours, Nagumo radioed the scout plane, ascertained ship types, and maintained contact. The response came at 08:09 hours. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The tactical situation had transformed from manageable to desperate. Tomonaga's strike force was recovering aboard the carriers, fuel tanks nearly empty, some aircraft damaged. The reserve aircraft were half rearmed, flight decks cluttered with ordnance dollies and fuel hoses. And somewhere to the northeast, American carriers were potentially launching their own strike force, which could arrive at any moment. Nagumo made a decision that prioritized immediate tactical efficiency over theoretical optimal timing. He would recover Tomonaga's returning aircraft, they couldn't be left to ditch in the ocean, then launch a fully coordinated strike against the American carriers. This meant accepting perhaps 45 minutes of vulnerability while deck crews recovered, refueled, and respotted aircraft. The alternative, launching an improvised, incomplete strike with half the aircraft still being rearmed, violated everything Japanese doctrine taught about maintaining formation cohesion and overwhelming concentration of force. It was rational. It followed his training. And it gave the Americans the window they needed. At 07:02 hours, 200 miles northeast of Nagumo's position, Enterprise launched the first of her strike aircraft. The launch sequence reflected the coordinated attack plan Fletcher and Spruance had developed over the previous 36 hours. Enterprise would commit her full air group, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers split between Bombing 6 and Scouting 6, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters for escort. Hornet would launch simultaneously with similar numbers. Yorktown, still recovering her morning search planes, would launch a follow-up strike at 08:38 hours. The American aircraft departed in squadron formations, flying independently toward the last known position of the Japanese carriers. This violated the tactical doctrine of coordinated mass attack. The proper technique was to orbit over the carrier while all aircraft assembled, then proceed together. But orbiting burned fuel, wasted time, and potentially revealed the American position to enemy scouts. The strike leaders calculated correctly that reaching the target quickly mattered more than arriving in perfect formation. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 off Enterprise's deck at 07:06 hours, heading southwest at 160 knots. His 14 Devastators carried Mark 13 torpedoes, notoriously unreliable weapons with a circular error probability that made. Hitting anything smaller than a battleship a matter of luck as much as skill. The TBD itself was obsolete by 1942 standards, maximum speed of 206 knots, service ceiling of 19,500 feet, armed with a single forward-firing 30 caliber machine gun and a flexible 30 caliber gun in the rear cockpit. Against modern fighters like the Zero, a Devastator's survival depended on maintaining formation integrity, coordinating with dive bombers to split enemy defenses, and accepting catastrophic casualties as the price of getting 1 or 2 torpedoes on target. The Wildcat escort never found Torpedo 6. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, aircraft flying at different speeds and slightly different headings diverged. By 09:20 hours, Lindsay's 14 Devastators were alone, approaching the Japanese fleet from the southwest without fighter cover and without the dive bombers who were supposed to attack simultaneously. At 09:18 hours, lookouts aboard Akagi spotted aircraft approaching from the east. Nagumo's carriers had just completed recovering Tomonaga's strike force and were in the final stages of preparing the counterstrike against the American carriers. The flight decks were chaos. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, fuel hoses snaking everywhere, ordnance carts positioned at each aircraft waiting for final loading. Perhaps 15 more minutes and the deck would be clear. The strike force launched. 15 minutes they didn't have. The first American attack came from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. VT-8 had become separated from the rest of Hornet's air group and located the Japanese carriers independently. Waldron led his 15 Devastators in from the southwest, descending from 1,500 feet to wave-top altitude for the torpedo run. The Zero Combat Air Patrol, at least 30 fighters maintained continuously over the fleet, fell on them with mechanical efficiency. The slaughter took 6 minutes. The Zeros attacked from above and astern, the Devastator's most vulnerable angle, firing 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns in carefully controlled bursts. The American rear gunners returned fire, but a single .30 caliber machine gun against 4 to 6 Zeros per Devastator was mathematical suicide. One by one, the TBDS exploded, caught fire, or simply disintegrated. Lieutenant George Gay, VT-8's sole survivor, would later describe watching each of his squadron mates die in sequence, methodical, inevitable, complete. 14 aircraft destroyed. 29 men killed. Not a single torpedo hit. At 09:25 hours, Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived from a different bearing and met the same result. Lindsay led his formation toward Kaga, holding formation even as Zeros tore into them. The Devastators pressed their attack with stubborn professionalism, maintaining course and altitude, dropping their torpedoes at ranges between 800 and 1,200 yards. 10 of 14 aircraft were shot down before reaching release point. The survivors escaped only because they had dropped their weapons and could use their meager speed advantage to run. 0 hits on the Japanese carriers. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked at 09:35 hours. 12 aircraft, 10 shot down, 2 survivors. Still 0 hits. 41 Devastators. 35 destroyed. 77 men dead or dying in the water. 0 torpedo hits. By any tactical measure, the American torpedo strikes were a catastrophic failure, a perfect demonstration of obsolete aircraft and defective weapons employed against superior fighters and skilled pilots. But they accomplished something the American commanders hadn't specifically planned. They dragged every Zero in the combat air patrol down to wave-top altitude. The Japanese fighters, operating under doctrine that prioritized destroying immediate threats, pursued the torpedo bombers because torpedo bombers could sink carriers. Dive bombers, still 10 minutes away and 15,000 feet higher, presented no immediate danger worth climbing back to altitude to intercept. At 09:22 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 32 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprises Bombing 6 and Scouting 6, emerged from cloud cover at 14,500 feet directly above the Japanese carriers. McCluskey had led his dive bombers southwest based on the morning's search reports, found empty ocean, made the calculated decision to extend southwest, and finally spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at maximum speed. He followed that wake straight to the carrier force. What he saw below represented a target so perfect it seemed impossible. 4 carriers in box formation, flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, no fighters at altitude, all attention focused on the low-level attacks still in progress. The carriers were approximately 2 miles apart, close enough that one squadron could engage multiple targets, far enough that a single attack couldn't damage them all. McCluskey divided his force instantly. Bombing 6, 14 aircraft under Lieutenant Richard Best, would take the closest carrier, which Best identified as a Kagi based on the distinctive red rising sun insignia on the forward flight deck. McCluskey would lead the remaining 18 aircraft from Scouting 6 against the second carrier in line, Kaga. The third carrier, McCluskey identified it as Soryu but wasn't certain, would have to wait for Yorktown's air group, still inbound. At 09:25 hours, McCluskey nosed over into a 70-degree dive, airspeed building rapidly past 250 knots. The SBD Dauntless was arguably the best dive bomber in service with any Navy in 1942. Stable, accurate, capable of absorbing significant battle damage. Each aircraft carried a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 14-inch naval shell, fused for 0.01-second delay to penetrate the flight deck before detonation. The dive bombing approach minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire, perhaps 20 seconds from. Initial dive to release altitude at 2,500 feet, and delivered accuracy that torpedo attacks could never match. A competent pilot could expect to land 1 in 3 bombs within 30 feet of the aim point. The Japanese carriers opened fire as the Dauntlesses committed to their dives, but reaction time from identification to effective fire was insufficient. Heavy machine guns and 25mm automatic cannon put up a ragged barrage, but the dive bombers were through it and releasing before the gunners could track effectively. McCluskey's first section released at 09:26 hours and 30 seconds. Best's section followed at 09:26 hours and 45 seconds. At least 3 1,000-pound bombs struck Kaga within 90 seconds. The first hit aft of the island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar deck, where fully fueled aircraft awaited launch. The detonation touched off aviation gasoline that had been sloshed during refueling operations. Fire spread instantly through the hangar, igniting ammunition and additional aircraft. The second bomb hit further forward, near the aircraft elevators, and the third struck the forward flight deck among parked aircraft. Within 3 minutes, Kaga was burning from bow to stern, secondary explosions rippling through the hull as ordnance cooked off. Akagi took 2 hits, perhaps only 1 depending on which damage assessment you credit. Best's section came in steep and fast, releasing at minimum altitude. 1 bomb struck the flight deck amidships among the parked aircraft, detonating torpedoes and fuel that instantly transformed the carrier into an inferno. Fire spread to the magazines with horrifying speed. Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered counter-flooding to correct the list, but control systems were already destroyed. By 09:45 hours, Akagi was dead in the water, listing to port, her crew abandoning ship. Yorktown's air group, 17 dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived over the Japanese formation at 09:27 hours, only 2 minutes behind Enterprise's attack. Leslie selected the northernmost carrier, Soryu, and led his squadron into their dives. 3 bombs hit. The first struck forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar deck. The second hit amidships, detonating among aircraft being armed for launch. The third hit aft, near the aircraft elevators. Like her sisters, Soryu had fully fueled aircraft spotted on deck, ordnance positioned for loading, and aviation gasoline vapor throughout the hangar spaces. All the elements required for catastrophic damage. She was abandoned at 10:45 hours and sank at 19:13 hours that evening. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were destroyed. Nagumo transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara at 10:46 hours. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been positioned north of the main formation and escaped the initial attack. Her air group, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, launched a counterstrike at 10:58 hours against the American carriers, whose position had been reported by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Hiryu's strike found Yorktown at 12:05 hours and pressed home an attack that mirrored the destruction they'd just witnessed. 3 bombs hit Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck and starting fires that knocked out power to 6 boilers. The carrier lost propulsion and came dead in the water. Damage control teams fought the fires and restored partial power by 13:40 hours, enough to make 17 knots. But at 14:30 hours, a second Japanese strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers from Hiryu, hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes on the port side. The explosions ruptured fuel tanks, flooded machinery spaces, and jammed the rudder. Yorktown assumed a 26-degree list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship at 1500 hours. Hiryu's position was reported by Yorktown scouts at 1445 hours. Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers at 1530 hours. They found Hiryu at 1700 hours, screened by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 4 destroyers. Formidable anti-aircraft protection. The Dauntlesses attacked through heavy fire. 4 bombs hit. Hiryu burned through the evening and into the night. She was scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 0510 hours on June 5th, torpedoed after the crew abandoned ship. The Battle of Midway continued for another 2 days as American submarines and aircraft pursued retreating Japanese forces. The final accounting showed catastrophic losses for the Imperial Navy. 4 fleet carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 3,057 personnel killed, including many of the most experienced carrier pilots in the Japanese Navy. American losses, though significant, were disproportionately lower. 1 carrier sunk, Yorktown, succumbed to submarine torpedoes on June 7th while under tow. 1 destroyer sunk, 145 aircraft destroyed, and 307 personnel killed. The strategic implications reshaped the Pacific War. Japan's carrier force, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was crippled. Replacing the 4 carriers would take 2 years. Replacing the experienced pilots would prove impossible. The Japanese naval aviation training system could not produce replacements at the rate combat was consuming them. After Midway, Japan transitioned from offensive operations to defensive consolidation, a posture from which it never recovered. Yamamoto withdrew the invasion force and returned to Japan, having accomplished nothing. The operational concept, drawing the American fleet into a decisive battle, had succeeded, but the outcome was exactly inverted from Japanese expectations. Midway remained in American hands. The Central Pacific remained contested rather than dominated. And the strategic initiative passed permanently to the United States. The battle also validated intelligence as a decisive element of naval warfare. Rochefort's code-breaking had provided Nimitz with comprehensive intelligence about Japanese intentions, force composition, and timing, advantages that offset Japan's numerical superiority. After Midway, American cryptanalysts continued breaking Japanese naval codes, providing operational intelligence that shaped every subsequent campaign. Rochefort himself received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1943, though bureaucratic infighting within Navy intelligence would limit his advancement and eventually drive him from code-breaking work. The water deception, the simple ruse that confirmed AF meant Midway, occupies a unique place in the battle's history. It was never classified as a formal intelligence operation or given an operational code name. It appears in Rochefort's subsequent testimony as a casual aside, something his team thought of and executed without elaborate approval processes. The radio operators at Midway, who sent the false water shortage message, probably never knew what their transmission accomplished. The Japanese intelligence analysts who dutifully reported that AF is short on water certainly never suspected they were confirming the target for an American ambush. But that single confirmation, purchased with 1 false radio message, enabled Nimitz to position his carriers with certainty rather than hope. It transformed what might have been a speculative deployment into a calculated ambush. The 3 American carriers at Midway carried approximately 3,000 personnel among their air groups and ships companies. Had those carriers been positioned incorrectly, sent to the Aleutians, or held at Pearl Harbor awaiting confirmation, they would not have been at Midway to blunt the Japanese offensive. Midway itself, with perhaps 3,000 defenders between Marine and Navy personnel, would have fallen after sustained bombardment and assault. The titles claim that one radio operator's message saved 3,000 lives is actually conservative. The immediate tactical impact affected roughly 6,000 American personnel aboard the 3 carriers and at Midway. The strategic impact, preventing Japanese domination of the Central Pacific and shortening the overall war, affected millions. Numbers that large become abstractions. Perhaps it's better to think of it simply: a small deception, executed well, at exactly the right moment, changed the trajectory of the world's largest war. The men who fought at Midway, American and Japanese alike, demonstrated extraordinary courage within the brutal calculus of carrier warfare. The torpedo squadron pilots who pressed their attacks knowing they were flying to certain death. The dive bomber pilots who held course through anti-aircraft fire because their shipmates below needed them to succeed. The damage control parties who fought fires aboard burning carriers, maintaining discipline even as explosions tore through their ships. The Japanese aircrew who launched from Hiryu knowing their own carrier might not survive long enough to recover them. They were professionals doing a terrible job under impossible conditions, and they did it with a competence that still resonates 8 decades later. The victory at Midway wasn't inevitable. It resulted from intelligence correctly interpreted, commanders making aggressive decisions, and fighting men executing those decisions with skill and sacrifice. The water deception gave them the opportunity. They seized it and changed history. If you found this story worth your time, a like genuinely helps others discover it. Please subscribe and hit notifications. We're bringing these forgotten missions and the men who flew them back into the light. Real stories, real people. No Hollywood exaggeration. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and if someone in your family served in these wars, we'd be honored to hear about it. These men and their actions deserve to be remembered accurately. Thank you for listening and for keeping their memory alive.